The United States and Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy one another. And that created a strange problem. How do two superpowers fight a global struggle when fighting each other directly could lead to catastrophe? The answer was brutally simple. Much of the fighting would happen somewhere else. Across Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Middle East, local struggles became entangled with the larger contest between Washington and Moscow. Governments were armed, insurgencies were funded, advisors were dispatched, coups were supported, and wars that began because of local political, ethnic, economic, or nationalist tensions could suddenly become pieces of a much larger geopolitical struggle. From the chaos of the Congo to the mountains of Afghanistan, millions of people will ultimately live and die on these other battlefields of the Cold War. This is how the Cold War turned the world into a battlefield. The story begins not in Washington or Moscow, but in the ruins left by the Second World War. For centuries, European empires had controlled enormous portions of Africa and Asia. But after 1945, that system began rapidly breaking apart. Indonesia fought for independence from the Netherlands. France struggled to maintain control of Indochina. Nationalist movements spread across Africa, and dozens of new nations began emerging from the wreckage of the old colonial order. The United States generally encouraged decolonization, although American policy was often complicated by its relationships with European allies and by the rapidly growing fear of communism. Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands had their own economic and strategic interests in maintaining overseas influence. The Soviet Union saw something different. Anti-colonial movements offered Moscow an opportunity to portray communism as an alternative to Western imperialism and economic exploitation. Suddenly, newly independent nations became politically important far beyond their borders. By 1960, the US was fully engaged in a game of decolonization realignment with the Soviets, with both sides trying to attract as many countries as possible to their political and ideological side. That competition created one of the defining characteristics of the Cold War. Washington and Moscow usually avoided fighting one another directly. Instead, they supplied governments, insurgencies, revolutionary movements, and regional allies with money, weapons, intelligence, advisors, and political support. But there's an important distinction. These countries are not simply pawns on an American-Soviet chessboard. Their conflicts frequently had deep local origins that existed independently of the Cold War. What the superpowers often did was enter those conflicts and transform them. Few places demonstrate that better than the Congo. The Congo had been one of the most brutally exploited territories of European imperialism. Originally controlled personally by Belgium's King Leopold II before becoming the Belgian Congo, the territory entered the post-war era amid rising demands for independence. Belgium eventually agreed to relinquish control. On June 30th, 1960, the Congo became independent. Almost immediately, the country began coming apart. The army mutinied. Violence erupted. Belgian forces intervened officially to protect Belgian citizens. And the mineral-rich province of Katanga declared its independence from the new Congolese state. Into this chaos stepped Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba sought assistance from the United Nations and the United States. When Western assistance failed to meet his needs, he increasingly turned toward the Soviet Union. And suddenly, a crisis that had begun with colonialism, independence, political rivalry, military mutiny, and regional separatism acquired another dimension: the Cold War. The Soviets provided assistance to Lumumba. The United States increasingly feared that Moscow could establish a major foothold in Central Africa. Belgium remained deeply involved. The United Nations deployed one of the largest peacekeeping operations in its history up to that point, and Congolese factions themselves fought for control of their country's future. As I described the situation in my original research, the Congo became, quote, a brewpot of death and convoluted objectives during the Cold War, end quote. That description captures what makes the Congo Crisis so important. There wasn't one simple war. There were overlapping struggles for political power, regional independence, control of natural resources, post-colonial sovereignty, and international influence. Lumumba was eventually removed from power and murdered in January 1961. His death remains one of the most controversial episodes of the Cold War in Africa. But the violence continued. By 1964, another major rebellion threatened the Congolese government. The United States and Belgium supported the government, while outside assistance also reached rebel forces. American aircraft and logistical support contributed to government operations, while Belgian paratroopers, transported by American aircraft, conducted Operation Dragon Rouge to rescue hostages held at Stanleyville. The Congo had become precisely the kind of conflict that would characterize much of the Cold War: a local crisis, foreign intervention, competing ideologies, and ordinary people trapped between them. The eventual human cost was staggering. Estimates vary considerably, but tens of thousands died during the Congo Crisis. And yet the superpowers still had not fought one another. They didn't have to. Others were doing the fighting. Nearly 20 years later, the same basic Cold War dynamic appeared again. But this time, one of the superpowers entered the battlefield directly. On December 27, 1979, Soviet forces intervened in Afghanistan. Soviet special forces attacked the presidential palace and killed Afghan leader Hafizullah Amin. Moscow installed Babur Kemal and poured military forces into the country to support Afghanistan's communist government. But controlling Kabul was one thing. Controlling Afghanistan was something else entirely. Across the countryside, disparate resistance movements, collectively known as the Mujahideen, fought against the Soviet-backed government and Soviet forces themselves. President Jimmy Carter reacted strongly to the invasion, calling it, quote, the greatest threat to peace since the Second World War, end quote. Washington responded without sending American troops to fight the Soviets. Instead, the United States supported the Afghan resistance with money, intelligence, and weapons. Pakistan became the critical conduit through which much of that assistance passed. Other countries, including Saudi Arabia, Britain, China, and Egypt, also supported the anti-Soviet resistance. Eventually, American-supplied Stinger missiles gave Mujahideen fighters a particularly effective weapon against Soviet aircraft. Once again, a local conflict had become part of the Cold War. But Afghanistan also demonstrated the terrible human consequences of proxy warfare. Soviet operations devastated parts of the countryside. Millions of Afghans became refugees. Civilian deaths reached staggering levels. The Mujahideen suffered enormous casualties. And more than 13,000 Soviet troops were killed before Moscow finally withdrew its forces in 1989. Afghanistan did not single-handedly destroy the Soviet Union, but the war imposed significant military, political, and economic costs on a Soviet system already facing profound internal problems. 2 years after Soviet forces left Afghanistan, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The Congo and Afghanistan were separated by thousands of miles in nearly 20 years. Their histories were profoundly different. But together they reveal something essential about the Cold War. The struggle between the United States and Soviet Union was never confined to Berlin, nuclear missiles, spies, or summit meetings. It reached into countries undergoing revolutions, civil wars, independence movements, and political upheaval. And once the superpowers became involved, local struggles could acquire global significance. That raises an uncomfortable question. Did the collapse of the old colonial empires actually free newly independent countries from great power competition? Or did it sometimes replace one form of outside influence with another? Again, in my original work, I describe this process provocatively as a form of, quote, ideological imperialism, end quote. That phrase should not erase the enormous differences between European colonialism, American foreign policy, Soviet intervention, or the agency of the people living in these countries. But it does identify something important. The Cold War was a competition for influence, and the battlefield was often someone else's country. Washington and Moscow avoided the catastrophic war against one another so many people feared. But that did not mean the Cold War remained cold. For millions of people around the world, it was anything but. I'm Michael Stroud, and remember, history matters because people matter. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate if you would like the video, subscribe to History with Michael Stroud, share it with someone who enjoys history, and leave a comment below. Every like, comment, and share helps more people discover the channel and allows me to continue bringing these stories to life. I release new history documentaries every Tuesday, Thursday, and Sunday, so be sure to click the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. For more historical articles, speaking information, and my latest research, please visit michaelgstroud.com. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.